The folded sketch hit the table between them like a gunshot. Naomi Rhodes stared at it, her chest tight, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. Around her, the saloon of Caldwell, Kansas, had gone absolutely silent. Every man at every table had turned. The piano player had stopped mid-note. The bartender had set down his glass so carefully it made no sound at all. And there, across from her, stood Ira Keller, broad-shouldered, jaw set like granite, dark eyes burning with something she could not yet name, holding the edge of the paper down with one calloused finger, as though he feared it would fly away and take the truth with it. "Look at it," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the tremor underneath it, the thing he was holding back by sheer force of will. "Look at what you drew." Naomi's hands didn't shake. That was the thing about her, they never shook. Not when she'd faced a sandstorm alone on the open range at 17. Not when her father had pressed a worn charcoal stick into her hands and told her that seeing clearly was the most powerful weapon a person could carry. Not even now, when the sketch she had made in secret 3 days ago, the sketch that she had folded and tucked deep into her saddlebag, and told no one about, was lying open on a saloon table in front of a gunslinger who was either going to thank her or destroy her for it. She looked. The drawing was precise. It always was. Her lines were confident, architectural in their accuracy. She had drawn the Greer ranch yard at noon, with the sun directly overhead so the shadows were short and factual. She had drawn every figure in that yard, 5 men, 3 positioned along the fence, 1 crouched near the water trough, and 1 standing at the center with his arm raised and a revolver in his hand. She had drawn the angle of that arm. She had drawn the direction of every man's face. She had drawn what no one else had apparently bothered to record, which was that the man standing at the center, the man with the raised gun, the man who had pulled the trigger, was not Ira Keller. It had never been Ira Keller. The silence in the saloon stretched so thin it could have been cut with a blade. Ira's dark eyes moved from the sketch to her face, and in them she saw something crack open. Not weakness, nothing so simple as weakness. Something older, something that had been locked behind iron for a very long time. He had been riding for 3 days with a murder charge on his back, with half the county believing he had shot Deputy Harlan Greer in cold blood on his own brother's property, and he had walked into this saloon not knowing whether the woman who had witnessed the whole thing was going to hand him a rope or a lifeline. "When did you draw this?" he asked. 20 minutes after it happened," Naomi said. "Same as always." And that was where the story truly began. Naomi Rhodes had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882, not as a bride, not as a teacher, and not in search of a husband, which made her immediately suspicious to every person who saw her step off the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe railway car with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a flat wooden drawing case under her arm. She was 24 years old, with dark copper-brown hair that she kept pinned at the nape of her neck in a practical knot, and eyes the color of a late afternoon sky when the weather was about to change, not quite gray, not quite blue, but the particular shade between the two that made you feel the air pressure dropping. She was not soft in the way that frontier towns expected women to be soft. She was not hard in the way they feared either. She was something else entirely, something that took most people a while to categorize, which she had learned to simply accept as the permanent condition of her life. Her father had been a land surveyor, one of the best in Missouri. He had died of fever when she was 19, leaving her his drafting tools, his eye for measurement, and his absolute conviction that the world should be recorded as it actually was, and not as people wished it to be. In the years that followed, Naomi had discovered that those skills, the surveying, the precise technical drawing, the ability to look at a landscape or a scene and translate it onto paper with documentary accuracy in a matter of minutes, were genuinely extraordinary. She had done boundary surveys for 3 counties in Missouri. She had testified in 2 land disputes and won both of them, because her drawings were so precise and so legally defensible that the other side's lawyers could find no credible argument against them. She had been written about in a St. Louis newspaper under the headline "The Lady with the Infallible Eye," which she had clipped out and immediately lost because she had no patience for her own mythology. She had come to Caldwell because the Sumner County Land Office had hired her to complete a survey of disputed ranch boundaries along the Cimarron Range. It was good work, clear work, the kind of work she understood. She had not anticipated Ira Keller. She had not anticipated any of it. She had set up her temporary residence in the back room of Widow Callahan's boarding house on the eastern side of town, a modest room with a good north-facing window that gave her clean light for her drawing work. She had organized her tools, the drafting compass, the straightedge rules, her collection of charcoal sticks and graphite pencils, her India ink and her finest mapping pen, with the particular precision of someone who knew exactly where everything needed to be to function at maximum efficiency. She had paid for 2 weeks in advance. She had asked Widow Callahan where she could hire a reliable horse. That question, as it turned out, led her directly to the Greer Ranch. The Greer Ranch was the largest in the county, run by a man named Theodore Greer who was somewhere in his late 50s, and possessed of the particular combination of wealth, entitlement, and local political influence that made him nearly untouchable. He ran a significant cattle operation, employed a dozen hands, and had his fingers in various other arrangements that people mentioned only in careful, oblique terms. His younger brother, Deputy Harlan Greer, had been the law in Caldwell for 6 years, which meant that Theodore's interests and the town's legal apparatus were arranged in close and comfortable proximity to each other. Naomi had known none of this when she went to the Greer Ranch to ask about horse rental. She had simply been directed there by 3 separate people, all of whom told her that Greer kept the finest stock in the county, and that he occasionally rented to working professionals coming through the area. She had ridden out in the rented spring wagon that Widow Callahan kept for guests, arrived at the ranch yard just before noon, and been told by one of the hands to wait near the gate while her inquiry was taken to the main house. She had waited, and while she waited, she had done what she always did when she was standing still in an interesting location with her drawing case at hand. She had opened it, taken out a fresh sheet, and begun to sketch the scene around her. She always said it was habit. In truth, it was closer to compulsion. Her eye had been trained so completely to observe and record that she felt slightly agitated when she wasn't doing it. She sketched the fence line, the positioning of the water troughs, the arrangement of the outbuildings relative to the main house. She noted proportions instinctively, placed figures where she saw them. She drew with the automatic confidence of someone for whom precision was not effort but instinct. She was perhaps 6 minutes into the sketch when the argument started on the other side of the yard. It began as raised voices, distant enough that she couldn't make out the words. 2 men near the south fence, gesturing with the heated energy of something that had been building for a while. Then a 3rd man came out of the barn. Then 2 more came around the corner of the bunkhouse. She kept drawing, because her survey training had taught her that scenes should be recorded as they were happening and not reconstructed afterward, and her hand moved across the paper with practiced calm even as the voices grew louder. She saw the gun come out. She saw the angle of the arm. She had a surveyor's eye for angles. She could estimate them accurately to within 2 or 3 degrees without any instrument at all. She noted the direction. She noted the position of each figure. She drew what she saw, not what she thought she understood, because there was a discipline in her work that demanded the separation of observation from interpretation. The shot was a single sound, clean and hard in the noon air. When the dust and the chaos settled and she understood what had happened, that Deputy Harlan Greer had been shot and killed, that the men in the yard were shouting and scattering, that someone was already riding hard toward town, Naomi had folded her sketch, tucked it carefully into her satchel, and stood very still for a moment, thinking. She was thinking about what she had drawn. And she was thinking about the fact that the man everyone was currently shouting about, the man whose name they were calling out as they pointed and gestured, Ira Keller, a ranch hand who had apparently been employed at the Greer operation for several months, was not the man she had seen fire the gun. The man she had seen fire the gun was someone else entirely, and he was still standing in the yard. She had ridden the spring wagon back to Caldwell at a careful pace, because she was not impulsive and she was not naive, and she understood immediately that she was in possession of information that powerful people would very much prefer she not have. She understood that Theodore Greer was influential. She understood that his brother had been, the deputy. She understood that in a town where those two facts were true, the course of a murder investigation was unlikely to be governed primarily by evidence. She had gone to her room. She had sat at her desk and looked at her drawing for a long time. Then she had done two things. She had made a careful ink copy of the sketch, with precise notations of angles and distances in the margins, the kind of technical annotations that would satisfy a court. And she had written a brief letter to the county attorney in Wichita, which she had given to the outgoing mail before dinner. Then she had waited. She had waited with the patience of a woman who had learned that the right moment to act was not always the first moment available, and she had watched the town's response to the shooting with the observational detachment of someone conducting a documentary survey of human behavior under pressure. The response was, broadly speaking, exactly what she had expected. Ira Keller had been publicly named as the shooter by 3 of the men who'd been in the yard, all of whom were Greer hands. A warrant had been issued by the circuit judge, who was a regular guest at Theodore Greer's dinner table. The sheriff, a man named Prout who moved through life with the careful wariness of someone who understood exactly which side of his bread was buttered, had organized a search party. What Naomi had not expected was for Ira Keller to walk into the saloon himself. She had been there that evening for a perfectly practical reason. The saloon served the only reliable hot meal in town after 6 o'clock, and Widow Callahan's kitchen closed at 5. She had been sitting at a corner table with her survey notes and a plate of beans and cornbread, which was about as domestic as she got, when the door had opened and he had walked in. She had recognized him from her sketch. In the drawing, she had placed him near the south fence, about 40 feet from the central action, which was important because it established distance and confirmed line of sight. In life, he was taller than she had estimated and considerably more substantial, broad through the shoulders, with the particular kind of physicality that came from years of genuine outdoor labor rather than the studied posturing that some frontier men affected. He had dark hair, several days of dark stubble on a jaw that looked like it could take a considerable amount of impact and give very little back, and eyes that she noticed immediately were not moving the way a guilty man's eyes moved. He wasn't scanning for exits. He was scanning for faces, reading the room, making assessments. His hands were visible, which meant he was deliberately keeping them visible, which meant he understood how this situation looked, and he was managing it with intelligence. He had seen her drawing case on the table next to her survey notes. He had looked at it for a moment longer than anyone else in the room had. And then he had walked directly to her table, sat down without being invited, and said, "You were at the Greer ranch today. I saw you at the gate." "You have a good memory," she had said. "I have a precise memory," he had said. "It's the only thing that's going to keep me alive tonight." "You had a drawing board." She had looked at him for a long, measured moment. She had learned to read people with the same patience and accuracy she brought to her survey work. She read him carefully. She read the anger in him that was controlled and directed inward rather than exploding outward. She read the fear that was present but not dominant. She read the fundamental, bedrock quality of a person who had been wronged and knew it, and was trying to find a way to prove it rather than simply deny it. She had reached into her satchel and placed the sketch on the table between them. That was where they had arrived, at the moment in which the folded paper hit the table like a gunshot, and the saloon went silent, and 3 days of desperate writing and a murder charge, and the particular kind of loneliness that came from knowing the truth when the world had decided otherwise, all collapsed into the space between two people who were strangers looking at something that might save one of them. Ira stared at the sketch for a long time. Naomi watched him read it the way her father had once told her a good drawing was meant to be read, not glanced at, not interpreted in a rush, but followed, line by line, angle by angle, until the image arrived in the mind as clearly as a memory. "That's Vince Carver," Ira said quietly. He placed his finger on the central figure, the one with the raised arm and the gun. His finger was not shaking. "He works the South Range for Greer. He and Harlan had a dispute over a horse sale. I heard them arguing about it 2 weeks ago. I don't know who any of them are," Naomi said. "I drew what I saw, but you know what this means." "I know what my drawing documents," she said carefully. "What it means legally is a question for the county attorney in Wichita, to whom I have already written." He looked up at her then quickly, and she saw the thing in his eyes again, that cracking open quality, that sense of something long-locked encountering something unexpected. "You already wrote." "I wrote before I knew you'd walked into this saloon," she said. "I wrote because my drawing shows what actually happened, and I am not in the habit of sitting on evidence because it's inconvenient." He was silent for a moment. The saloon around them had returned to a cautious approximation of its normal activity, though she noticed that several men at nearby tables were paying exaggerated attention to their drinks. "They'll come for the sketch," he said. "Greer will know you were there. He'll want it gone." "Then it's fortunate," Naomi said, "that I made a copy." That was the first time she saw Ira Keller's face do something she hadn't anticipated. His expression shifted, the hard control breaking just slightly, and what came through was not quite a smile. It was something more complicated, more specific. It was the expression of a man encountering a quality he had not expected to find, and finding it remarkable. "You made a copy," he said. "I always make copies of legally significant survey documents," she said. "It's standard professional practice." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an attention that was different from how men usually looked at her, not appraising in the predictable and tedious way, not with the particular kind of frontier condescension that she had learned to simply outlast, but with the focused regard of someone who was genuinely recalibrating their understanding of a situation. "What are you?" he asked. "I mean, what do you do?" "Land surveyor," she said. "Commissioned by the county land office. I draw boundaries, elevations, property lines, and anything else that requires precision." "And crime scenes," he said. "That particular skill set was not in my contract," she said, "but it appears to be relevant." There was a pause, and then she hadn't expected this, he laughed. It was brief, barely a sound, quickly controlled again, but it was genuine, and it softened his face in a way that changed it considerably. She filed it away without entirely understanding why. "My name is Ira Keller," he said. "I know," she said. "The whole saloon has been trying not to look at you since you sat down. I'm Naomi Rhodes." "Miss Rhodes," he said. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm asking because I have very few options left and none of them are good." "Ask," she said. "Will you come with me to the county attorney in Wichita, in person, with the sketch and your testimony?" She had already thought about this. She had thought about it in her room the night before, working through the logistics and the risks with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to a complex survey. The risks were real. Theodore Greer was powerful and connected, and anyone who challenged his preferred narrative of his brother's death was going to face pressure of various kinds. She had already identified this as a potential danger when she had written the letter to Wichita, but she had also surveyed the situation and reached a clear conclusion. The sketch was evidence. Her testimony was evidence. And evidence in her professional philosophy was a thing that existed to be used, not hoarded. "Yes," she said, "but we ride at first light, and I keep the original sketch on my person until we reach Wichita." He nodded. There was nothing soft about his agreement, no excessive gratitude, no fumbling display of relief. He simply nodded once, the way a person acknowledged a practical arrangement. She respected that. "I'll be at the livery at dawn," he said. He pushed back his chair and stood, and she noticed again how tall he was, not in a threatening way, but in the way that some landscapes were large, in a way that made you recalibrate your sense of the space around you. He looked down at the sketch on the table. "Miss Rhodes, why did you wait? After you saw what you saw, why didn't you come forward immediately?" It was a fair question, and she gave it a fair answer. "Because I surveyed the terrain first," she said. "And the terrain was not favorable for an immediate advance." He looked at her for another of those calibrating moments, and then he nodded again, and he left. Naomi sat alone at her table for another 20 minutes, finishing her beans and thinking about the exact dimensions of what she had just agreed to. The beans were lukewarm and the cornbread was dry, and the thinking was thorough. By the time she paid her bill and gathered her things, she had a clear plan. The next morning was a pale silver gray when she arrived at the livery stable on the edge of town, her satchel packed with the essentials, her drawing case secured to the back of the horse she had finally arranged to rent. A solid bay mare named, according to the livery owner, Clementine, who was steady and sensible, and had been described as not the kind to spook, which Naomi considered an essential quality in a working horse. She had the original sketch tucked in the inner breast pocket of her coat, which she wore buttoned despite the warming morning. She had her ink copy in her satchel. She had the letter she'd drafted to the county attorney in Wichita, though she now expected to deliver her testimony in person before any letter arrived. Ira was already there. He had a lean roan gelding that had clearly covered some hard ground in the past few days, and he was checking the animal's shoes with the methodical attention of a man who understood that good horsemanship was not optional in the kind of territory they were about to cross. He glanced up when she arrived, assessed her preparation in a single quick look, and apparently found it adequate because he said nothing except, "Good morning." "Good morning," she said, and that was the entirety of their social exchange before they rode out. The road to Wichita was roughly 50 miles northwest, which under normal conditions would have been an easy 2-day ride. These were not normal conditions. Theodore Greer was a man of resources, and Naomi had reason to believe that his resources would be directed, at some point, toward intercepting them. This belief was confirmed about 6 miles outside of Caldwell when they became aware that they were being followed. Ira noticed it first, which she acknowledged with a kind of professional respect. His spatial awareness in open terrain was clearly trained and accurate. He said nothing, simply altered their pace with a subtle shift that she read correctly and matched. They moved off the main road and through a stretch of tall bluestem grass that was thick enough in late spring to provide genuine concealment, moving northeast for a mile before circling back to rejoin the track at a different angle. The followers, 2 riders, she established by listening, took a while to realize they had lost the trail. In that time, Naomi and Ira crossed a creek, rode along the eastern bank where the ground was harder and left less impression, and put several miles between themselves and any pursuit that required a clear track to follow. "You handle a horse well," Ira said when they had established that they were, for the moment, alone. "My father didn't believe in being incompetent at things you needed to do," she said. "What did your father do?" "Land surveyor. Before him, his father was a cartographer in Maryland. I come from a family of people who look at things carefully and write down what they see." He considered this. They rode for a while in the easy silence of people who are comfortable without constant conversation, which Naomi found refreshing. Most people, she had noticed, became anxious in silence and tried to fill it with unnecessary words. Ira did not seem to have this problem. "How'd you end up in Caldwell?" he asked eventually. "Contract work from the land office, disputed boundaries on the Cimarron Range." She glanced at him. "What about you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I've been working the Greer ranch for about 8 months. I came down from Colorado. I had a spread up there, small one near Pueblo. Lost it in a bad winter, cattle took sick, I couldn't cover my debts. I've been working other men's land since then." "You want your own land again," she said. It wasn't a question. "I want a lot of things," he said, and something in his voice was careful, measuring. "What I've got right now is a murder charge, which tends to narrow your immediate priorities considerably." "The charge will be challenged," she said. "That's what the evidence is for." He looked at her sideways, not skeptically, but with a kind of wondering directness that she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "You sound very certain." "I'm always certain when I'm working from documented facts," she said. "It's the undocumented situations that require more caution." They camped that first night in a hollow just south of a line of cottonwoods, along a creek that she identified by her survey maps as a tributary of the Ninnesca River. Ira had a small amount of provisions, hardtack, dried beef, coffee, and a fire kit, and he built a fire that was well sheltered and low, which she approved of. She made coffee with the efficiency of a person who had spent considerable time in the field, and they sat across from each other in the firelight, and for a while neither of them spoke. Then she spread her survey map on the ground between them and showed him the route she had planned. He leaned over it, studying it, and she watched him read the map with the quiet attention of someone who actually understood what he was looking at. A lot of people, she had found, looked at maps without being able to read them. They saw lines and symbols where she saw terrain and distance and implication. But Ira traced the route she had marked with his finger, identified the landmarks she had noted, and after a moment said, "If they know the country at all, they'll expect us to cross at the Ninnesca Ford. It's the obvious route." "That's why we're going further north," she said. "There's a shallower crossing about 3 miles upstream. Less obvious, less traveled. And the terrain on the far bank is more broken, which gives us better concealment if we need it." He looked up at her across the firelight, and she saw that expression again, the one she had started to recognize, the one that was something between admiration and a kind of surprised satisfaction. "You planned this route before we left," he said. "Last night," she confirmed. "I used my survey maps and the topographic knowledge I've accumulated from the contract work in this area." "You planned our escape route while you were eating beans in the saloon," he said. "I plan a great many things while eating," she said. "It's efficient." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement but in a kind of wondering acknowledgement. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "I have met a lot of capable people in my life. I've worked with men who were genuinely excellent at what they did, but I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you." She met his eyes and held them. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and there was something in the single word that was quiet and definite and somehow weightier than the conversation around it seemed to call for. "It's the opposite of a problem." She looked back at her map and told herself that the warmth she felt was from the fire, which was, strictly speaking, in the vicinity of being true. They broke camp early, before the sky was fully light, and reached the alternate ford by mid-morning. The crossing was easier than she had estimated. The spring water was cold and fast-moving but not dangerous, barely reaching the horses' bellies at the deepest point, and they crossed without incident. On the far bank, they paused to let the horses drink and rest briefly, and Naomi used the time to take a series of survey measurements for her county contract, because she was professional enough to do her paid work even in the middle of an extrajudicial fugitive situation, which she thought her father would have appreciated. She was working with her compass, noting bearings in her survey book, when Ira came to stand near her. He watched her work for a while. She could feel his attention, steady and observant but not intrusive. Then he said, "Can I see how you do that?" She glanced at him. "The compass bearing, all of it, the way you're recording it." She showed him. She explained the basic principle of triangulation, demonstrating how she established her position relative to 2 visible landmarks, a distinctive cottonwood to the north, the far bank of the creek to the west, and how the intersection of those bearings established a fixed point that could be repeated and verified. She showed him how she noted distances using her pacing method, which her father had drilled into her until her stride was calibrated to a known length. She showed him how she transferred the measurements to her map, building an accurate picture of the terrain from a series of individual, precise observations. He followed it all with a focus that was genuine and impressive. He asked 2 questions, both of them intelligent and specific, the kind of questions that indicated real engagement rather than polite performance. When she finished explaining, he looked at the map, then at the terrain, then back at the map. "That's extraordinary," he said. "You can build a picture of an entire landscape from standing in one place and measuring." "From several places," she said. "The more fixed points you establish, the more accurate your map. One point gives you a location. Multiple points give you the truth of the whole territory." He looked at her with an expression that she was beginning to categorize as specifically his, the one where he looked as though he was deciding something, though she couldn't always tell what. "Is that what you did with the sketch?" he said. "At the Greer ranch, multiple fixed points. Essentially, yes. I sketched the positions of everyone in the yard relative to fixed reference points: the gate, the water trough, the bunkhouse corner. So the distances and angles are defensible. You can derive from the geometry of the sketch where each person was standing, which direction they were facing, and from the angle of Carver's arm the approximate trajectory of the shot." He went very still. "You can prove the trajectory from the sketch." "The sketch itself doesn't prove anything," she said carefully. "But combined with my testimony about what I observed, and if the physical evidence at the scene hasn't been disturbed, the trajectory can be reconstructed from the documented angles. It's the same principle as a survey. You're just reconstructing a moment rather than a landscape." Ira turned away from her and looked at the horizon, and she gave him that moment of privacy, because she understood that she had just told him his life could be reconstructed from her careful observation of a 12-minute scene at a ranch yard on a Tuesday afternoon, and that was a significant thing to absorb. When he turned back, his face was composed again, but his eyes were bright. "Thank you," he said. "I drew what I saw," she said. "That's all I ever do." They rode through the rest of the morning in the broken country north of the Ninneska, making good time on hard terrain. Around midday, they stopped in the shade of a limestone outcrop to rest the horses and eat, and it was there that the second complication of the journey materialized, not Greer's men this time, but a different kind of problem entirely. A man was sitting against the far end of the outcrop, half hidden by shadow, and he spoke before they saw him clearly, which established his intentions as non-hostile, since anyone planning an ambush would not announce themselves. He said, "You're Keller," and then when he stepped into the light, Naomi saw that he was a lean man in his 40s, wearing a deputy's star that was not from Sumner County. His name was Marsh. He was from the Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office out of Wichita, and he had been dispatched south when the county attorney received Naomi's letter, which had arrived faster than she had anticipated because she had given it to a commercial rider rather than the regular mail. He had been riding to Caldwell when a rider out of town, one of Greer's men, he suspected, told him Keller had already fled, and he had taken the alternate route on a calculated guess. "Smart guess," Ira said. "Less me and more your travel companion," Marsh said, looking at Naomi with frank curiosity. The county attorney's letter referenced a survey professional with documented evidence. "I figured if there was a survey professional involved, she'd know about alternate routes." Naomi almost smiled. "The county attorney read my letter, read it, shared it with the county judge, who is a great deal less cozy with Theodore Greer than the circuit judge down in Caldwell," Marsh said. "There's an inquiry ordered. What I need is to get you both to Wichita without whatever Greer's got following you catching up." "I've been managing that reasonably well," Naomi said. "Yes, ma'am," Marsh said, in the tone of a man who was revising a previous assumption. "I can see that." The three of them rode north together, and with a Sedgwick County deputy at their side, the remaining miles to Wichita had a different quality, still cautious, still watchful, but with the added legitimacy of official escort that changed the calculus of any potential interception. They reached Wichita late the following afternoon, dusty and saddle-tired, and Naomi delivered herself and her sketch directly to the county attorney's office before she did anything else, including eat. The county attorney was a man named Halloran, precise and methodical, who examined the sketch with the focused attention of someone who understood its value. He studied her technical annotations. He asked her a series of questions about her methods, her credentials, and her field of expertise, all of which she answered with complete accuracy and without embellishment, because embellishment was for people who were uncertain of their facts. By the end of the interview, Halloran had the expression of a man who had received an unexpected gift and was still determining its full implications. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "this sketch, combined with your testimony, represents some of the most compelling forensic documentation I have encountered in my practice. The angular analysis alone, the trajectory implications, this is professional-grade survey methodology applied to criminal evidence." "It's the same eye," she said. "Looking at a boundary line or looking at a crime scene, the principle of accurate observation doesn't change." Halloran nodded slowly. He looked at Ira, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the office throughout the interview. "Mr. Keller, I'm going to be honest with you. The warrant out of Caldwell is legally problematic, given the judge who issued it and his documented relationship with the Greer family. I'm going to pursue an immediate review of that warrant and simultaneously file for a formal inquest into Deputy Harlan Greer's death based on this evidence." "How long will that take?" Ira asked. "The warrant review, 2 or 3 days if I push it. The inquest, perhaps 2 weeks before it convenes. I would strongly suggest that you remain in Wichita in the meantime." Halloran paused. "I can arrange accommodation for Miss Rhodes at the Carey House Hotel if she's willing to remain as well. Her testimony will be essential for the inquest." Naomi had not planned to remain in Wichita for 2 weeks. She had a survey contract to complete in Sumner County and a methodical professional life that did not generally accommodate open-ended residencies in towns that were not her contracted work location. But she also had a clear and unambiguous sense of obligation, and the obligation here was not even remotely ambiguous. She said she would stay. Ira looked at her when she said it, and she did not look back at him, because she was busy committing her decision to memory and making a mental list of the arrangements she would need to make. And looking at his expression when he found out she was staying would have been a distraction she wasn't ready to process yet. The Carey House was a real hotel, which Wichita in 1882 was large enough to support. It had a proper dining room and a writing desk in each room, and a view from Naomi's window that showed the Arkansas River cutting through the flat Kansas landscape with the silvery precision of a natural boundary line, which she found aesthetically satisfying. She organized her room in her customary fashion, set up her drawing work at the desk, and wrote a letter to the Sumner County Land Office explaining the delay in her survey contract, citing her legal obligation as a material witness, which was both true and professionally legitimate. Then she went down to the dining room for dinner, and Ira was there. He had clearly cleaned up, freshly shaved, his hair combed, wearing a different shirt than the one he'd ridden in, one that was dark and fitted and made him look considerably more put together than 3 days of hard frontier riding had suggested he could. He was sitting alone at a table near the window with a cup of coffee and an expression of someone who was coming down from a sustained period of high-level threat and was not entirely certain what to do with the relative safety of a hotel dining room. She sat at his table without waiting to be invited, which she had noticed he seemed to accept as her established operating mode, and ordered the beef stew, which was the most sensible item on the menu, and they ate together and talked. And for the first time since the saloon in Caldwell, the conversation wasn't shaped primarily by urgent practical necessity. He told her about Colorado, about the spread near Pueblo that he'd worked and lost the small herd he'd built up over 2 careful years, the particularly brutal winter of 1880 that had decimated cattle operations across the southern range, the debt that had compounded faster than he could manage. He told it without self-pity, but she could hear what was underneath the telling, the specific grief of a person who had built something with their own hands and watched it taken away by circumstances that had nothing to do with their choices or their efforts. She told him about Missouri, about her father's survey business and the years she had worked alongside him, learning the craft, about the 2 land dispute testimonies that had established her professional reputation, about the newspaper article which she hadn't saved, which he seemed to find faintly amusing. "You don't keep records of your accomplishments," he said. "I keep records of the territory," she said. "The accomplishments are just what happens when you look at the territory clearly enough." He shook his head in that way he had, that wondering, calibrating movement. "You know," he said, "I've spent most of my life around people who say the right things and mean something else entirely. Greer's men. The banker in Pueblo who said he was extending my credit and then called it in at the worst possible moment. The deputy who told me when I arrived at the ranch that Harlan Greer was a fair man." He paused. "You say what you mean." "It's simpler," she said. "It's rare," he said. She looked at him across the table, and she was aware of something she had been peripherally aware of since the saloon in Caldwell, a quality of attention in his regard that was not like any attention she had been subject to before. It was not admiring in the way that was about her appearance. It was not respectful in the careful, arm's-length way that men sometimes respected capable women, because they were slightly afraid of them. It was something more direct and more personal than either of those things, and it was increasing steadily in the days they had spent together, accumulating with each exchange, each demonstration of how the other person actually operated, each moment of genuine recognition. She had not come to Kansas to fall in love with anyone. She had come to do boundary surveys. She was aware, in the thoroughly logical part of her mind that governed most of her decisions, that the current situation was highly unusual, and that unusual situations were fertile ground for the kind of feelings that didn't survive the return to normal circumstances. She was also aware that she had spent 2.5 days riding through the Kansas countryside with this man, and that she had assessed him the way she assessed terrain carefully, from multiple angles, with constant attention to what was actually present as opposed to what was merely presented, and what she had found, consistently and without exception, was someone who was exactly what he appeared to be. That, she had to concede, was also rare. The 2 weeks of waiting that followed were unlike any 2 weeks in her professional life, which had been characterized by purposeful movement and clear objectives. The inquest preparations proceeded in Halloran's office. Naomi gave a formal preliminary statement and submitted the annotated copy of her sketch as documentary evidence, and Halloran's team of investigators were dispatched to Caldwell to examine the physical evidence at the Greer ranch. She continued her survey work on the Cimarron boundary documentation, because she had her maps and her notes, and she could make considerable progress on the calculations and the final drawings from her desk at the Carey house. But she also found herself spending evenings with Ira in ways that had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the simple, particular pleasure of his company. He was remarkably perceptive. She had not expected that. She had expected the physical capability and the frontier competence, which were obvious, but the perceptiveness surprised her. He noticed things. He noticed when she was frustrated with a particular calculation and offered to talk it through, and his suggestions, while not technically expert, were structurally sound because he thought logically. He noticed when she was tired before she acknowledged it herself. He brought her coffee at her desk in the morning without being asked, having apparently observed, and remembered that she worked better with coffee than without it, which was a small thing and somehow not small at all. She noticed things about him, too. She noticed that he was up before dawn every morning without fail, which was a rancher's habit that persisted even without livestock to attend. She noticed that he read. She had seen him in the hotel parlor with a copy of the Wichita Eagle, and once, a book on land law that he had apparently borrowed from Halloran's office, which she found pointed and interesting. She noticed that he had a very specific way of dealing with difficult people, a quality of stillness and patience that was not passive, but was the kind of disciplined calm that indicated genuine confidence rather than performed toughness. She noticed that he looked at her in a way that made her feel, inexplicably, as though the territory of her own character had finally been accurately mapped by someone other than herself. On the 8th day of the waiting period, something happened that brought everything to a sharp and sudden point. Theodore Greer arrived in Wichita. He came with 2 lawyers and the circuit judge from Caldwell in his party, which was a bold display of connected influence that was clearly calculated to apply pressure to the county attorney's inquest process. He checked into the Carey House, which was the best hotel in Wichita and therefore his natural habitat, and at dinner that evening, the dining room being the gathering place of anyone staying at the hotel, he was seated at a table near the window, and Naomi saw him for the first time. He was a large man, Theodore Greer, with the well-fed solidity of entrenched prosperity and a face that was organized around the permanent assumption that things would go his way. He had brought both of his lawyers and one of the men from his ranch, a heavy-set individual who was introduced to no one and sat at the table's far corner with the watchful stillness of hired security. Greer's eyes moved around the dining room with the assessments of a man cataloging what was in his territory, and when those eyes reached Naomi's table, where she sat across from Ira as she had done every evening for a week, his expression did something controlled and deliberate and entirely unpleasant. Ira saw it. His posture didn't change, which was its own kind of statement. "He's going to try to discredit the sketch," Naomi said, keeping her voice conversational. "The standard approach would be to challenge my credentials or argue that the drawing was made after the fact and reconstructed from accounts I heard rather than genuine observation." "Can he do that?" Ira asked. "He can try," she said. "My credentials are verifiable, my professional history is documented, and the sketch was made on fresh paper from my own stock, which is dated with the batch number from the manufacturer. More importantly, the annotations include angular measurements that can be independently verified against the physical dimensions of the Greer Ranch yard, which Halloran's investigators have surveyed." She paused. "The sketch is accurate. Accuracy ultimately defends itself." Greer was watching them. He raised his glass, a small mocking gesture directed at Ira. Ira looked at him steadily, said nothing, and returned his attention to his dinner, which was the correct tactical response and also, Naomi thought, the expression of a fundamentally decent person choosing not to perform for an audience that wanted him provoked. "He'll come at you directly," Ira said quietly. "Not tonight, but he'll find a way to approach you. He'll offer you something or threaten you or both." "I'm aware," she said. "I've prepared for that as well." He looked at her. "You've prepared for being threatened." "I prepared a comprehensive written record of all my observations, the professional methodology I used, and the timeline of my decisions, including my decision to write to the county attorney before I had spoken to you, which establishes that my motivation was documentary obligation rather than personal loyalty to you, which is the argument Greer's lawyers will most likely try to make." She cut a piece of bread with precise efficiency. "The record is dated, witnessed by the hotel owner here, and I have given copies to Halloran, to the county judge's clerk, and to a colleague in St. Louis." Ira Keller set down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment, and this was the moment. She would think about this moment later, many times, in the way you think about moments that marked a before and after. This was the moment when something in his face went completely unguarded. Not the wondering admiration she had seen before, not the impressed recalibration of his previous assessment. Something deeper than either of those things. Something that looked, she thought, a great deal like a person recognizing their own counterpart. "Naomi," he said, and her first name in his voice had a quality she was not prepared for. "Yes," she said. "How long have you been doing this?" he said. "Not the survey work, this." Planning 5 moves ahead, documenting everything, protecting yourself and everyone in your vicinity from things that haven't happened yet. She considered this with genuine honesty. Since my father died and I realized I was the only person responsible for my own situation, she said, which was about 5 years ago. And you've been alone that whole time. I've been independent, she said. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said softly. They're not. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Just for a moment, just briefly. The deliberate and careful contact of someone who understood that permission mattered and was asking, in a very quiet physical vocabulary, a question he didn't yet have the words for. She felt it from his fingertips to the center of her chest. She turned her hand over and held his for a moment, and then they both returned to their dinners, and neither of them spoke for a while. But the silence between them had changed into something that was warm and specific, and hers in a way she hadn't known to want. Greer approached her the following morning, as Ira had predicted. He caught her in the hotel corridor outside the dining room, with his more senior lawyer at his shoulder and his own large physical presence arranged to suggest that the corridor was somewhat narrower than its actual dimensions. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "I believe we haven't been formally introduced. I'm Theodore Greer." "I know who you are," she said, and did not stop walking. He fell into step beside her, which she had expected. "I understand you've been doing some survey work in my county," he said. "Good to have professionals in the area." "I agree," she said. "I also understand you've been involved in a rather unfortunate legal situation," he said. "I want you to know that I have no ill will toward you. I'm certain that you saw what you thought you saw, and I respect that. But you're operating in a county you don't know well, and you may not have the full context for what happened at my ranch that day." "I don't require context for an angular measurement," she said pleasantly. "The angle of an arm is the angle of an arm regardless of who's explaining it to me." A brief pause in his stride. "Miss Rhodes, you're an intelligent woman. I imagine you understand that legal situations can be complex, and that witnesses sometimes find themselves in difficult positions when the cases they're involved in become complicated." "Are you threatening me?" she asked, still pleasantly. "Not at all," he said, in the tone of a man who was absolutely threatening her. "I'm simply suggesting that there may be ways to resolve this situation that are better for everyone." "Better for you, you mean," she said. "Mr. Greer, I am a commissioned survey professional with documented evidence, a formal preliminary statement on record with the county attorney's office, and multiple copies of that documentation held by parties in 3 separate locations. I am scheduled to testify before the county inquest panel in 6 days. My personal well-being and my professional standing are both protected by the accuracy of my documentation, which is extensive." She stopped and turned to face him. "I don't respond to implications, and I don't make alternative arrangements with people who murdered their own relatives to cover financial disputes. Good morning." She walked to the dining room and ordered her coffee, and her hands, as always, did not shake. Halloran told her that afternoon that Greer had filed a motion to delay the inquest, citing procedural irregularities in the warrant review process. The county judge had denied it. Greer had then filed a motion to compel the production of additional evidence, which was transparently a delay tactic but which would nonetheless need to be answered. Halloran was frustrated but unworried. "He's using resources to buy time," Halloran said. "But the evidence is solid, and every day that passes is a day the physical survey of his ranch yard accumulates more corroboration for your sketch." "Is there anything else you need from me?" Naomi asked. "Your testimony at the inquest," Halloran said, "and your steadiness, which I don't think you're lacking." She found Ira in the hotel parlor that evening. He was sitting in a chair near the window with a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading it. He was looking out at the last light over the Arkansas River with an expression that was thoughtful and quiet and a little distant. She sat in the chair across from him, and he came back from wherever his thoughts had been and looked at her. "Greer's delays aren't going to work," she said. "I know," he said. Halloran's confident. "The physical survey supports my sketch on every measurable dimension." "I know," he said again, and then, "Naomi, I need to say something and I want to say it correctly, which is not a thing I'm always capable of." She set down her survey notes and gave him her complete attention. "When I walked into that saloon in Caldwell," he said slowly, "I had been riding for 3 days, and I had exactly no good options and a murder charge on my back that I couldn't disprove because the only witness I knew of was a ranch hand who'd had the sense to disappear immediately afterward." He paused. "I walked in because I'd heard you were there that day, and I thought there was maybe 1 chance in 10 that you'd seen something useful and an even smaller chance that you'd be willing to say so, because Greer was powerful and I was nothing." "You weren't nothing," she said. "You were wrongly accused, which is a specific and serious thing. I sat down at your table," he said, "and you put that sketch in front of me and I looked at it and it was everything. It was the whole truth of what happened, laid out with so much precision and care that there was no way to misread it." He looked at her steadily. "And I thought, who is this woman? What kind of person does this? Sits in a ranch yard while a man is being shot and killed and draws the whole thing with a compass eye, and then goes home and makes a copy and writes a letter to the county attorney." "A surveyor," she said. "Someone extraordinary," he said. "And then I rode 2 days through the backcountry with you and watched you read the terrain like it was a book written for you personally, and plan routes, and survey creek crossings while being a fugitive, and face down Theodore Greer in a hotel corridor like he was a minor inconvenience." He shook his head. "I've never met anyone like you, Naomi. I want to be very clear about that." She was quiet for a moment, weighing things with the particular care she brought to anything genuinely important. "What are you saying, Ira?" "I'm saying that I've been falling in love with you since you put that sketch on the table," he said. "And I know the timing is complicated, and I know you have a life and a practice that has nothing to do with me or Kansas or any of this, and I'm not asking you to arrange your life around a man who currently has a contested murder warrant on his record. I'm just saying it because you deserve to have the truth said to you directly by someone who means it." Naomi had been looked at, assessed, underestimated, occasionally correctly evaluated, and twice asked to dinner by men in various frontier towns in the course of her professional life. She had felt, in those circumstances, the particular mild discomfort of being the subject of attention she hadn't solicited. She had never felt what she felt now, which was something that moved through her with the quality of a precisely confirmed measurement, clean, undeniable, settling into its correct place with a click of recognition. "The timing is complicated," she agreed, "and I do have a life and a practice." She paused. "I'm also currently sitting in Wichita for an indeterminate number of days as a material witness in a legal inquest, with a completed survey contract in Sumner County to collect payment for, and no immediate professional obligation that requires me to leave Kansas in particular haste." He looked at her carefully. "Is that you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying," she said, "that I am in the habit of being very precise about things that matter to me, and you matter to me, and I wanted you to know that I am equally clear about it." He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the small table between their chairs, and this time he took her hand deliberately and held it, and she held his, and they sat in the quiet parlor of the Carey House Hotel with the last light fading over the river and the weight of the whole complicated situation around them. And it felt, somehow, like the most settled she had been in 5 years. The inquest convened 6 days later in the Sedgwick County Courthouse, a solid brick building that smelled of linseed oil and legal precedent. The panel consisted of 3 judges: the county judge, a circuit judge from Topeka, and a retired federal magistrate who had been brought in to ensure no one could argue local bias in either direction. Halloran presented his case with the methodical confidence of a man who had been a prosecuting attorney for 20 years and understood that a good case was built like a good structure, from the foundation up, with every piece load-bearing. Naomi was called to testify on the second morning of the inquest. She had worn her best professional dress, dark navy, clean and pressed, with no ornamentation that could be read as attempting to charm the panel, because she was there as an expert witness, and she intended to be evaluated as one. She brought her original sketch, her annotated copy, and her survey field notes from the day in question. She was composed in a way that went beyond training. She was composed because the facts were on her side, and the facts were what she dealt in, and there was nothing on earth that gave her more confidence than standing in a truth she had documented herself. Greer's lawyers cross-examined her for nearly 2 hours. They challenged her credentials. She produced documentation. They challenged her methodology. She explained it in technical terms that demonstrated comprehensive mastery of her field. They challenged the timing of the sketch. She produced the paper's batch markings and manufacturer's date code. They challenged the possibility that she had constructed the sketch from accounts rather than direct observation. She walked the panel through the angular measurements in her field notes, which corresponded precisely to the physical dimensions established by Halloran's survey team, measurements that would have been impossible to fake, because she had not had access to those physical measurements prior to submitting her original notes. The senior federal magistrate asked her a technical question about the angular precision of her work, and she answered it in detail that made the man sit back in his chair with the expression of someone who had not anticipated that level of sophistication. Vince Carver, who had been located and brought to Wichita by a team of Sedgwick County deputies, was called on the 3rd day. Under the weight of the evidence, with the sketch laid out and explained by a survey expert whose testimony had been unshakable, his account fell apart in the way that false accounts do when they encounter true ones, not dramatically, not with a great confession, but with a gradual, piece-by-piece failure of internal consistency, each small inconsistency cracking the structure until it couldn't hold the weight of itself. Carver's attorney negotiated a lesser charge in exchange for a full account of what had happened: the dispute over a stolen horse, the confrontation he had arranged, the agreement with Theodore Greer that the death would be attributed to the first available scapegoat, which had been Ira Keller because Ira was new, had no deep local connections, and had been present in the yard that day. Theodore Greer was charged with conspiracy and obstruction. His ranch was already under financial scrutiny from the land office, which had been prompted by Naomi's boundary survey work, and the irregularities she had noted in her professional capacity, irregularities that turned out to connect to an ongoing dispute over claimed territory that Greer had never legally established. The warrant against Ira Keller was formally vacated on the 4th day of the inquest. Halloran delivered the news personally in his office, with Naomi sitting beside Ira and a pen and an official document that made it legal and permanent. Ira looked at the document for a long time. She watched him read it line by line, the same way she had watched him read her sketch in the saloon that first night. Then he looked at her, and she saw in his face the full complexity of what had just happened, the relief, the exhaustion of sustained tension finally releasing, the particular kind of gratitude that went beyond words because words were insufficient containers for it. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. His voice was rough. She reached over and took his hand, as she had learned to do in the parlor of the Carey house 8 days ago, and held it, and he held hers, and Halloran very professionally found something to look at on the other side of his desk. They walked out of the courthouse together into a clear Kansas morning in May of 1882, and the light was brilliant, and the air smelled of river grass, and the horse traffic on the street was going about its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that something important had just concluded, which was how the world generally operated, which she had always found vaguely appropriate. The world's indifference to individual important moments was what made those moments belong entirely to the people experiencing them. "What do you do now?" she asked. He squinted into the light. "I have been thinking about that," he said. I have some money saved from 8 months of ranch work. Not a lot, enough for a start. There's land available in the Cimarron Range, she said. I know because I've been surveying it. The Greer operation's disputed holdings are likely to be resolved in the next few months, which will make additional acreage available in that area. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I think about terrain, she said. It's what I do. Naomi. Yes. When your contract work is done, he said, where do you go? She considered this honestly. The truth was that she went wherever the next contract was. She had a room she rented in St. Louis when she wasn't in the field, a modest and practical arrangement for a person who lived primarily in motion. She had colleagues but not close friends, in the way that perpetually traveling professionals generally did not accumulate close friends. She had her work, which she loved genuinely and completely. Wherever the work is, she said, usually. Would you consider staying in Kansas, he asked. Not instead of your work, alongside it. I don't want you to stop doing what you do. I want the opposite of that. I want you to keep doing exactly what you do in a place where I might be able to see you do it. She turned and looked at him fully. He was standing in the courthouse steps, morning light, the brilliant May sunshine on his face, and he was looking at her with that expression she had catalogued and kept the specific, honest, unguarded attention of a person who had found someone they recognized. There's considerable survey work in Sumner County still, she said. The Cimarron Range boundaries are complex and the county contract is multi-year. That's a practical answer, he said. I am a practical person, she said. But yes, I would consider staying in Kansas. He smiled, fully, finally, the kind of smile that arrived when someone had been holding it back for days and stopped making the effort. It changed his face entirely, made it warm and open and slightly devastating, and she was aware that she was smiling back, which was not a thing she did carelessly. Then let's go have breakfast, he said, and offered her his arm in the courtly way of a man who had been raised to know the gesture and hadn't had much occasion to use it. And you can tell me everything you know about the Cimarron Range. She took his arm. The months that followed were the most unexpectedly full of Naomi's professional life. She completed the Sumner County survey contract, which turned out to be more extensive than initially scoped, because the dissolution of Greer's claimed holdings opened up a significant new boundary project that the county contracted her to manage as well. She was out in the field 4 days a week, working with her compass and her straightedges and her meticulous notebook, mapping the reality of a landscape that had spent years being misrepresented by a powerful man's false claims. Ira found 40 acres on the eastern edge of the Cimarron Range, land that was not prime but was solid, good grass, a reliable water source from a spring-fed creek, terrain that was workable for a small cattle operation if a man was patient with it. He bought it with his savings and a modest loan that a Wichita bank was willing to extend on the basis of his clean legal record and Halloran's informal endorsement, which counted for something in those financial circles. He began building. Naomi found, on her survey days in that area, that her route fairly often brought her within reasonable distance of his 40 acres, and she would stop and find him at work, framing the house, digging the root cellar, building the fence lines that would define his cattle range. And she would sit and eat lunch with him, and they would talk about the land and the work and everything else. And on the days that her route didn't naturally pass that way, she sometimes adjusted the route for efficiency reasons that were only approximately accurate. He knew. He never said anything about it, but she could tell that he knew, and the knowledge was warm between them like the particular warmth of being understood without having to explain yourself. He proposed to her in October, which was when the survey contract for the season wound down, and the autumn weather had put a golden edge on the tall grass of the Kansas range. He did it with the same direct, unpretentious honesty that characterized everything about him, not with elaborate staging or grand performance, but standing in the doorway of the house he had framed and half completed, showing her the interior, explaining what each room was going to be, and then turning to look at her and saying, "I want to build this with you, Naomi. Not for you. With you. I want to know what you want and build it together." She stood in the unfinished house on his 40 acres in the Kansas autumn, with the smell of fresh-cut timber around her and the sound of the creek from the north pasture and the particular quality of the afternoon light in October that was low and gold and made everything it touched look significant. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." "Name it," he said. "I keep the survey practice," she said. "I keep working. I'm not going to be a ranch wife in the sense of putting my work down." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking you to marry me, not to become a different person." "Then yes," she said. They were married in December of 1882 in the Caldwell courthouse, which had been significantly reorganized since the Greer inquest, with a new circuit judge and a new deputy who was a quiet, competent man named Aldridge who had no known relationships with anyone seeking to control the legal apparatus of Sumner County. The ceremony was witnessed by Widow Callahan, who cried, and Deputy Marsh, who had ridden down from Wichita, and Halloran, who sent a congratulatory letter because he couldn't make the journey but wanted them to know he was pleased with how things had resolved. Naomi wore a dress she had purchased in Wichita deep blue-green, practical in cut but beautiful in fabric, the kind of dress that could be worn to a ceremony and then worn again without looking as though it was trying to recapture something. She had done her hair properly, the dark copper brown of it pinned with care, and a few strands loose in a way that was intentional rather than accidental. When Ira saw her walk into the courthouse, she watched his face do the thing she loved best, that complete, unguarded opening, the expression that was just him, just the truth of what he felt, with no management or performance between her and it. They went home to his 40 acres. Their 40 acres now, which felt different and important, and celebrated with a dinner that Naomi cooked with the same precise efficiency she brought to her survey work, which meant it was excellent and ready on time. And afterward they sat by the fire in the partially finished house, with the winter coming down over the Kansas range, and the stars enormous and cold through the uncurtained windows, and she thought that she had surveyed a great deal of territory in her life, carefully and accurately, and she had never mapped anything as true as this. The spring of 1883 brought new growth in several simultaneous directions. The cattle Ira had purchased in the fall, a modest starting herd, carefully selected, the quality of each animal evaluated with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, had come through the winter well, which was more than many of their neighbors could say. The range that spring had the look of land that had been properly rested, and the grass came in thick and early. By April, Ira had expanded the herd to 30 animals and had fenced the north pasture, which meant the operation had moved from aspiration to reality in a way that was genuinely satisfying to observe. Naomi completed the final deliverables on the Sumner County contract in February and had, by March, received 3 new inquiries for survey work, one from the county land office directly, one from a private landowner on the western range, and one, surprisingly and pleasingly, from a law firm in Wichita that had been watching the Greer case and understood that forensic survey documentation was an emerging and valuable discipline. She had taken all 3 contracts, organized her schedule with her customary precision, and established a working pattern that allowed her to spend 4 days a week in the field or at her desk and 3 days at the ranch, which she found was an accurate ratio for her actual needs. She was on the eastern range one afternoon in April, taking a final measurement for the private landowner contract, when she realized with a particular kind of calm certainty that her body was telling her something. She finished the measurement, recorded it in her notebook with the same care she gave every notation, and rode home. She told Ira that evening while he was washing up after the day's fence work, his sleeves rolled to the elbow and his hands red from the cold water. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything. He went still for a moment in the way he did when processing something significant. Then he turned around, and his face was doing the thing, and he crossed the room in 3 steps and held her very carefully, very completely, with the same thoroughness of attention he gave to everything. Their son, James, was born in November of 1883, in the room with the north-facing window that gave good light, which was Naomi's office during work hours, and had been converted to the most appropriate birthing room in the house by virtue of its practical qualities. He was a solid, healthy, observant baby who arrived in the world with his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular quality of regarding things with composed and focused attention. Ira held his son for the first time with the careful, enormous tenderness of a man encountering a thing that undid every hard wall he had ever built, and Naomi, tired and satisfied and entirely herself, watched from the bed and thought that this, specifically this, was a fixed point from which she could take all her bearings. The entire territory of her life mapped from here. Theodore Greer was convicted in the spring of 1883 on conspiracy and obstruction charges, serving a sentence that reflected the weight of what he had done without being entirely equal to it, which was the kind of partial justice that the legal system in 1882 Kansas was capable of delivering. And Naomi had made peace with partial justice as a category, because she understood that the alternative to imperfect systems was no system at all. And no system at all was considerably worse. His ranch and land holdings were broken up, some sold at auction, some absorbed into adjacent properties, and the landscape of Sumner County rearranged itself accordingly. Vince Carver served a longer sentence for the actual killing in the Wichita Federal Facility. Deputy Marsh had been promoted to sheriff of Sedgwick County by 1884, which was a satisfying outcome. The survey work continued to expand. By 1885, Naomi's practice was large enough that she had trained 2 assistants. She insisted on training them herself, because she had very specific standards for accurate observation, and was unwilling to let those standards be diluted, and was providing forensic survey documentation to 3 county courts on a retainer basis. The Wichita law firm had sent her more cases than she had anticipated, each one involving a boundary dispute or a property conflict where her precise documentation made the difference between chaos and clarity. She loved the work as much as she had ever loved it, possibly more, because now she came home from it. In 1886, their daughter, Clara, arrived with her mother's copper-brown hair and what appeared to be a natural aptitude for spatial reasoning, which Naomi noted with the particular pleasure of a professional recognizing a talent before anyone else had categorized it. James, by this point, was a solemn and sturdy 3-year-old who had developed a devoted attachment to the horses and could name every animal in the herd. Ira's cattle operation had grown steadily to 60 animals by 1886, and the ranch had a settled, productive quality that reflected the consistent and careful work of someone who understood land and respected it. He had added a proper barn, a root cellar, a chicken house, and a covered porch along the south side of the house that caught the afternoon sun and was, Naomi found, an excellent location for review of survey documents on a fine evening. He had also, quietly and without drawing attention to it, become known in the county as a fair and reliable man, the kind whose word was trusted, whose assessments were sought in disputes between neighbors. He had no interest in politics or public office. He was forthright about that, but he had a quality of judgment and a reputation for honesty that made people bring him their problems, which he handled with the same steady, patient attention he brought to everything. Naomi had developed her own reputation, which was already considerable in professional circles and was becoming better known in the general community as well. She had given a public presentation at the Caldwell Courthouse in 1885 on the use of survey documentation in legal proceedings, which had been attended by more people than expected, and which had generated a follow-up invitation from the State Bar Association in Topeka. She had gone to Topeka, given an expanded version of the presentation, and returned to Kansas with 3 new professional contacts and the consciousness of having moved her field forward in a small but measurable direction, which was all she had ever asked of her work. The world around them was changing. 1880s Kansas was a place of significant transition, as the cattle trade that had defined the territory for decades began shifting, as the railroad reshaped the movement of goods and people, as the legal and political structures of statehood imposed new patterns on old landscapes. There were injustices in that changing world that Naomi did not look away from. She had grown up with a surveyor's eye for the reality of how land was held and taken and disputed, and she knew, with the clarity of documented fact, that the people who bore the greatest cost of the frontier's expansion were almost never the people who benefited most from it. She did the work she could within her professional authority, which meant surveying honestly, documenting accurately, and refusing to falsify boundaries on behalf of anyone, regardless of their wealth or connections. She was 30 years old in 1888, a year that felt, in the particular way of certain years, like a resting place from which to look backward and forward simultaneously. She had a practice. She had a home and a family and 40 acres of good Kansas range that she had helped to build and knew in the way that surveyors know land, which was more thoroughly than most. She had, against all prior expectation, and in the middle of what had been intended as a straightforward professional contract, found the most precisely matched person she had ever encountered, and she had done so by doing what she always did, by looking clearly, without flinching, at what was actually there. One evening in late September of that year, the autumn light doing its particular October-adjacent thing on the Kansas range, gold and long and specific, she was sitting on the south porch with her survey notes and a cup of coffee that was still hot. James was in the barn with his father, contributing a 5-year-old's concept of helpfulness to the evening feeding, which Ira managed with patient amusement. Clara was asleep. The ranch was in that particular evening quiet that she had come to know as its truest sound, the sound of a place that was fully itself. Ira came up from the barn and sat down on the porch steps, close to her chair. She could feel the warmth of the day on him, the outdoor honest smell of the work he'd been doing. He rested his elbows on his knees and looked out at the range as the last light went down. James told the horse he was going to be a rancher, he said, and a surveyor. He said he was going to measure all the cows. That's technically a function of herd assessment, she said. I support the ambition. He smiled at the range. She watched his profile in the last light, the set of his jaw and the lines around his eyes that the sun and the years had put there. He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had first seen across a folded sketch in a saloon in Caldwell 6 years ago, open, honest, specific to her. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the Naomi Rhodes who had stepped off a train in Caldwell in the spring of 1882 with her survey tools and her absolute self-sufficiency, and her complete lack of expectation that any part of what followed would happen. She thought about a folded sketch on a table, and the way two people can look at something true and see each other through it. "Yes," she said, "precisely and documentably." He laughed, that sound she had catalogued and kept, warm and genuine, the laugh of someone who found her genuinely funny and didn't try to hide it. Then he reached over and took her hand, the way he had in the parlor of the Carey house, the way he had been doing for 6 years, deliberate and careful and always asking rather than assuming. She held his hand, and the last light of September went down over the Kansas range, and the 40 acres that had been nothing but grass and hope when she first saw them lay quiet and settled and true in the dusk, a territory she had helped survey into being, and she was, as she had said, precisely and documentably, and in every way her thorough and accurate heart could measure, exactly where she was meant to be. The sketch, the original one, the careful charcoal lines on fresh paper that had changed both their lives, hung framed in the hallway of the ranch house between the parlor and the kitchen, slightly faded now. its annotation still legible in the margin in her precise hand. Visitors occasionally noticed it and asked what it was. She told them it was a survey document, which was accurate. Ira, when asked the same question, said it was the most important piece of paper in the county, which was, in its own way, equally accurate. James learned to read maps before he learned to read words, which his mother considered a defensible educational priority. Clara, at 2, had shown a distinct preference for her father's company in the barn and her mother's company at the drawing desk, which everyone agreed was a reasonable distribution of interests. The ranch grew steadily, managed with the patient competence of a man who had come back from loss and built something real. The practice expanded every year, managed with the methodical brilliance of a woman who had always known exactly what she was capable of, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to that knowledge. And in the mornings, before the work began, they sat together on the south porch with their coffee and the Kansas range before them, and talked, or didn't, and it was the specific and irreplaceable quiet of two people who had mapped each other completely and found the territory exactly to their satisfaction. The truth had been drawn and witnessed and held, and in the end it had given them each other, which was the best possible result of any accurate observation.